So chapter 1 is an introductory chapter, and so first of all, let's just ask ourselves, what is biology? And the general definition is the study of life, but this takes on many diversified subsets. There's botany, there's zoology, there's all sorts of things that are incorporated into the word biology. And so what we're going to be doing is looking at this broader aspect of life. Life is organized and grouped in unique levels of organization. And they start at the smallest and build upon each other. So at the bottom of this organizational pyramid is the atom. The atom is the smallest unit of ordinary matter. In chapter 2, we'll talk a little bit about atoms and how they interact with each other. They do have subatomic particles, but those subatomic particles are the same no matter what type of atom you're looking at. So we're going to start at the atomic level, and an example of this is carbon. Carbon is a very common atom in living organisms. And if you take several atoms and you put them together, or a cluster of atoms, then you have a molecule. A molecule, there are many diverse types of molecules in nature, and a lot of them are within organisms. These are called organic molecules, and we'll talk about that more in chapter 3. Just a note, an example of molecule is DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and it has carbon atoms associated with that molecule. So if you take those molecules and put them together, and they're functioning together, they'll form a cell. The cell is the smallest living unit. It can exist as a one-celled organism, or it can be a part of a multicellular organism. The cell is separated from its environment by a boundary called a membrane, in this case a plasma membrane. If we're looking at examples of this, and we'll have several chapters where we deal with cell structure, cell function, so we'll have several chapters that would deal with a cellular level. An example of a cell is like a neuron. A neuron is a nerve cell in organisms, of multicellular organisms. Then, if you take several cells and put them together and have them functioning in a similar way, these cells most of the time are similar in nature. Then you have a tissue layer. We will not get to that level. Anatomy and physiology takes care of that. So if you want to go on and learn about tissues, take anatomy and physiology. But an example of a tissue is white matter. White matter is a tissue layer in the brain. Living organisms are grouped in these levels, and so we've gone from the atom, and now the last one was tissue, So if you take several tissues and put them together and let them work in a similar function, then that is called an organ. Your brain would be an organ. It would have the white matter, the tissue layer, but it has also gray matter, which is a type of tissue layer, and so you have multiple tissues working together to form the brain, an organ. Then if you take a group of similar organs and have them work together in a specific function, then it's called an organ system. So the brain would be a part of the nervous system. And when you put that all that together, all the organs, tissues, cells of a multicellular organism, you get a multicellular organism. An organism is an individual living thing. Now, if you want to, you can draw a line from cell to organism, bypassing tissue, organ, and organ system, because, like I said, some organisms are one-celled, like bacteria or protozoa or algae. So they would bypass those levels and go straight to the organism level. An example of an organism is a flying squirrel, the western flying squirrel. So if you take a group of interbreeding individuals of the same species and you put them living, or they're living in a specific area, that's called a population. So the thing to think about here is that population is the same species, one species, all right? And so a group living in a given area. So our example that we've been going with is now the western flying squirrel that lives in the Cascade Mountains of Washington in the rainforest, all right? So that's a population. But if you take all the organisms that are living in a particular area, not just the flying squirrel, but the Douglas fir, the moss, the slime molds, birds, everything that's living in that area, then that's called the community. And that's just all the living organisms that live in the Cascade Mountain rainforest. Lastly, if you take the living things and the abiotic stuff, the non-living things, and you add them together, then that's called an ecosystem. So the Cascade Mountain rainforest in itself is an ecosystem, and things like water, geography, geology, climate, all that kind of stuff would be those factors that you would think of when you think of ecosystem, along with the community of organisms. So if you were looking at a cardinal and a robin and a blue jay in your backyard at the water bird bath, and you were watching their behavior, those three species, then you're looking at the community level. But if you add that they don't, let's say you observe that they don't use the bird bath unless there is certain amount of water in the bird bath, and so you are looking at the influence of the water depth in how those species use the bird bath, then that would be at the ecosystem level. Because you added water, which is abiotic. If you're Dian Fossey and you're studying gorillas in the Congo, mountain gorillas, and you're studying their mating behavior, then you're studying the population level. The scientific approach, all right, all sciences find out answers or supported answers for certain problems in science. And the way they do this is by using what is called the scientific approach. It doesn't matter what science you're looking at, they all sort of follow the same guidelines for how they do research. So the first thing that takes place is their observations. These observations can result from prior research, or they can be just something that you come across in nature. And once you have these observations, most of the time questions arise about those observations. Why did it happen that way? What is happening? How is it happening? So those kind of questions arise. And once you develop these questions, you want to figure out how you can test those questions and what the results are going to be. And so what you use then is a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a testable, tentative explanation for your above observations and questions. So why did it happen this way? I think it happened this way because, all right? And you try to explain that. Your prediction is really sort of rolled up into the hypothesis. It's just a statement of the expected results of observational or experimental tests. All right. And so once you've developed a hypothesis, you develop tests. These can be experimental or observational to see if that hypothesis can be supported. So you're walking down a path in a wooded area next to your house in the morning, and as you're walking, you hear the tree frogs going beep, 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 really high voice. All right. You don't think much about it, but you enjoy hearing them. And so you go home and everything's going all right. And so it was such an enjoyable experience that in the evening you decide to go on that same hike. You go the same way, and as you're going through the woods, you hear the tree frogs again, and they're going beep, 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 like Barry White, beep, all right? And so you made that observation. So you have made two observations. In the morning, they were high-pitched calls, and then in the evening, they were low-pitched calls. And that gets your mind wondering, why did they have two different calls? And again, that you made observations, and now you're developing question, right? So from that question, we develop a hypothesis, all right? So it has to be testable, but we want to see if that hypothesis can be supported. So our hypothesis is going to be that in the morning, that call, that high-pitched call, is a feeding call. And that's like gathering the frogs together and like, over here, here's some crickets, all right? And in the evening, we think that that is a mating call, all right? A call that the females are attracted to, all right? And so that is our hypothesis and prediction. So then we have to develop a test to see if we can support our hypothesis. And so what we'll have to do is go out and gather tree frogs from the same area, and you're really good because you can sex tree frogs. Okay, so you got males and females, equal number of males, equal number of females. You bring them back to a lab, you put them in terraria, which have similar vegetation and everything like that. And then what you're going to do is you're going to put the males in one of the terraria, the females in the other. Now, for the first part, you're going to have to feed, all right? And so you go and get crickets, and you put crickets in both terraria. The frogs go to town. They start eating, and so you've started feeding them, so they're used to that. And then you start your test. And so in the morning, you get up, you go in, you just look at the aquaria, and you record their sounds. And when you go in there that morning, they're going beep, 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 beep. And that's good, because that's what they were doing out in the wild. All right, so they're going beep, 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 beep. So you go and you put crickets in their containers, and they start eating, and they stop making the sound. All right, that's a great observation, a great test of your observation, right? And so in the evening, you're going to go back in and make observations and record their calls. And sure enough, when you get there in the evening, they're going beep, beep, beep. All right? Now, you're going to have to get rid of one of those variables that could confound your results. And so you're going to have to feed those frogs crickets again, to make sure that it's just not some other feeding call. So you put crickets in there, they just ignore the crickets. And they keep on going beep, beep, beep. And since they're tree frogs, they have suction cups on their hands and fingers. And so they're up on the glass, and the males are at one side of their terrarium on the glass, and the females are right up against the glass, right up against them in the other terraria. And so when their males are going beep, the females are attracted to that call, and they come toward the males. And so you do this over and over and over and over again. And if you get the same results, then you can decide that the results are worthy enough to publish, right? And so you publish your results that support your hypothesis, right? Some things about science and scientific approach, scientific knowledge, all right? The scientific approach must be repeatable and the process adaptable. So it's sort of like a recipe, all right? You follow the steps, and you should be able to get the same results in some other country, all right? If they have the same species of frog. You know. So it must be repeatable, and it can be adaptable. So while the other professor is looking at your results and going through your recipe, right, he finds something else. So he sort of goes in another direction with it, and so that it can be adaptable. Just remember that scientific knowledge is tentative. It can't be, that your hypothesis cannot be proven. It's just only supported. Now, in 1492, the world was flat, right? And that was the best scientific knowledge at the time. And so the hypothesis was that if you sailed to the end of the horizon, that you'd fall off the earth. Well, after that, they didn't fall off the earth, and it was found that that the Earth is an orbital, a orbish shaped planet, right? And so we have pictures from space and everything showing our planet, and we're pretty sure that it's an orbital orb-shaped planet, right? But we might not be able to experience some dimension where it's not exactly the same. All right, so we're 99.9999% sure that it's an orb, but there's always that there could be some information that is gained that will tell us that it may not be. So that's why it's tentative. It's not written in stone. It's not. It's flexible. All right, and the point to drive here is the hypotheses are not proven. All right, they're only supported. Results are open to challenge, reinterpretation, refinement. You'll, if you decide to publish results, you'll find that all scientists are very opinionated, and they will let you know that. And so it goes through that rigor of peer review. Science doesn't deal with hypotheses that cannot be tested, such as supernatural phenomenon or philosophical or religious questions. Some things are just things of faith that can't be tested, and so the scientific approach can't be really applied to that. So we talked about hypothesis being a tentative testable explanation for a question or observation. A theory is a broader thing. It's a set of hypotheses that taken together form a broad-ranging testable explanation about some fundamental aspect of life. All right, so natural selection might be one of those. Just to note, when you go from a hypothesis is very specific and testable. When you start taking a bunch of different hypotheses and then putting them together, there's going to be holes. And those holes normally are filled by opinion and conjecture and best known knowledge. So as you broaden your scope, the acuteness of what you're looking at gets less and less. All right, so just take that as take sometimes theories as a grain of salt. You know that there's good scientific knowledge in there, but there are also a lot of holes that are filled with opinion and conjecture. Living organisms are classified into 3 domains. Okay, domain is the broadest group of classification, and under those 3 domains you have 6 kingdoms. So the first domain is archaea, and the kingdom is Archaebacteria, and these are very ancient bacteria that usually live around in extreme environments. We'll talk about those in chapter 16. And then there's domain bacteria and the kingdom Eubacteria. If you see EU in front of a word in biology, EU is a prefix meaning true. So these are the true bacteria, what you think of when you think of Streptococcus and Staphylococcus and things like that. Both the domain archaea and domain bacteria are prokaryotic. Pro means early or first. Karyotic is referring to a nucleus. And a nucleus is a membrane that is surrounding the DNA that separates it from the rest of the cell. Prokaryotic cells, early or before, so these are cells that do not have a nucleus. They don't have that membrane around the DNA. So prokaryotic, both of those are prokaryotic. Both are single-celled. Even though you see that picture of the Streptococcus, they're in chains. Each cell is its own organism. They're just hanging out together. I used these terms before I defined them, but we will define them later. But they can be producers. They can produce their own food. They can be consumers. They have to have other organisms for food, and they can be decomposers, and that means that they can take dead organic or living dead material from organisms and then take the nutrients out of it and then recycle what's left back into the environment. So they can be all three of those. The last domain is domain Eukarya, and it has several kingdoms underneath it. The first being kingdom Protista, and the examples of these are protozoa and algae. Kingdom Eukarya, the cells are eukaryotic. EU means true, like we talked about before. Karyote means the nucleus. And so eukaryotic cells have that membrane around the DNA that separates it from the rest of the cellular material, and that's called the nucleus. The eukaryotic protista, the protozoa and algae, are single-celled for the most part. They're producers, consumers, and decomposers, but they are mostly single-celled. The next kingdom under Eukarya is kingdom fungi. These are mushrooms and molds and yeast and things like that, and they're eukaryotic, like the protists, but they are mostly multicellular. That's what separates them from protozoa or protists. They can be consumers, or decomposers. So a mushroom goes into the bar and he sits at the bar stool, and the bartender just ignores him, and he's sitting there and he kind of excuse me, and the bartender goes over and says, listen, we don't serve mushrooms in this facility. He goes, why not? I'm a fun guy. All right. Okay, so kingdom fungi. Then under Eukarya, we have kingdom plantae. These are trees, shrubs, wildflowers, moss. All of these organisms are examples of plants, right? And they're eukaryotic. They are multicellular, just like most of the fungi, and they are produced